And I'd like to ask a question of all the panel, but I will start with you, Ms. Amanpour. The United States has historically been known as a leader in all of these issues as far as transparency and freedom of the press and openness. It goes back to Chet Huntley and David Brinkley and Leslie Coburn and other great journalists. How is the United States viewed around the world now after some of these actions in the United States, attacks on journalists, and its actions it's taken with the new leadership at the USANG?
Well, look, the picture isn't pretty from around the world. On the other hand, of course, Congressman, there are many dictators, authoritarians, and non-democrats who are quite happy to see this happening in the United States of all places, because then they draw their own fake legitimacy from that. And that is a big problem. The chilling effect, beyond the actual attack on American journalism, the chilling effect, as Courtney and David have pointed out, on journalists around the world. And I can attest from covering countries that you might not even imagine, but their initial democratic, emerging democracies were essentially, driven by journalists on the front lines in countries around the world. It was journalists who were able to push the cause of democracy in some of the most unlikely corners around the world to the forefront. And when you see journalism as a profession now increasingly under attack, and as you know, according to the CPJ figures, that the leading cause of death against journalists around the world is deliberate targeting. We are not just caught in the crossfire. We do not just die of natural causes, but it is deliberate targeting that kills journalists, but it's all in the aim and in the name of silencing the messenger. And we just must be able to stand up for that. And yes, the view from around the world is sadly not encouraging right now.
Well, that's, I think, an understatement, but thank you very much, Ms. for either of our other panelists want to comment on that, the United States' role in the world when it tries to go and espouse democratic values with the present conditions in the United States from this administration and with the USAGM. Ms. Roch, do you have a comment?
Yes, I'd be happy to report, to respond to that, because part of what the Committee to Protect Journalists does is to try to protect journalists around the world. And we have historically relied on the United States to help with that. Now, granted, it doesn't have a perfect record, but it has typically stood up for these fundamental values. But what we have seen over the past few years, as Christiane referred to in her testimony, is that this false news rhetoric, this fake news rhetoric has reverberated around the world and had real impact and consequences for the freedom of journalists. We see a significant increase in the number of journalists who are imprisoned around the world on false news charges. We see that leaders of all political stripes are using the United States and its anti-press rhetoric and perception as an excuse and a cover for their own repression, from Hungary to Poland to Russia and Egypt, China even. And this is really problematic because it provides these leaders with a tool. And then, of course, we see the lack of U.S. leadership in standing up on behalf of journalists who are imprisoned around the world or who are under threat, including, for example, Maria Ressa, a Filipino-American journalist who is facing serious charges in the Philippines. And yet we've seen relatively little from the U.S. president or the high levels of the administrations, which we would expect to see. And we see this also now with COVID-19, providing a very convenient guise to, again, pass restrictive legislation that essentially criminalizes journalism or equates reporting critical or facts that don't comport with the official version with fake news. And we see journalists being imprisoned. We launched a big campaign to try to release all journalists imprisoned for their work around the world. Because of COVID, it could lead to a death sentence. And we've already seen now 2 journalists die in jail, including 1 in pretrial detention. Where is the United States on amplifying this call and using its diplomatic pressure to help release these journalists? So we're really seeing the reverberations of the lack of U.S. leadership on all of these issues.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Kaye, do you have a comment?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman Cohen. And I would just start by saying I fully share what Christian and Courtney have just said. In my view, as UN Special Rapporteur, that is, as somebody who's monitoring these issues around the world, it is exactly as described. The United States has simply lost its voice in tackling the false information laws that have really spread like wildfire over the last several years. But I did want to make maybe two quick points. One is that this does go back several years. So even before the Trump administration, there was an increase in pressure on journalists in the United States. There was an increase in leak investigations, an increase in prosecutions under the Espionage Act, which does not permit for a public interest exception and is frankly serves as a chilling effect, particularly on reporters and their sources in areas of the most urgent concerns, such as intelligence and national security. And then the second point I would say is that, interestingly, I think people around the world, journalists, governments, civil society, are really quite disappointed in not having the U.S. voice supporting them as it did in the past. So even when there were problems, even some that might have been on the margins with respect to U.S. practice against journalists, at the same time, the U.S. was an active promoter of journalism around the world, and an active promoter, not just for journalists per se, but as Christian really eloquently put it, a defender of the audience's right to get that information. This isn't a plea for journalists to be protected simply to protect their physical safety. It's a plea for their safety so that they can do the job of supporting democracy and access to information. I think that the United States leaving the Human Rights Council was a real suggestion that the United States is beyond reproach on these issues. And my real hope is that over time, the United States will return to that, will return to both protecting journalists at home, but also bringing back its voice to all of these different debates internationally. And I'm pleased that the Helsinki Commission is in a position to help do that.
Thank you, Mr. Kaye. Do you have a comment or anybody else about the actions with Mr. Pak's appointment and the firings that he's undertaken? Have they been noticed and are they concerning?
Those are noticed, and I'll say briefly, and I'm sure my co-panelists may want to say something here as well. First, with respect to the firings of the heads, the shakeup, as Courtney put it, around the media outlets, so Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and so forth. Those are problems because they suggest that those outlets, which have a deserved reputation worldwide for independence, will now be subject to political framing, to political constraint. That is a problem for the outlets. But the denial of visas, in particular, for those reporters, and the possibility that some of these reporters will be forced to go back to their homes, where they could be subject not just to prosecution, but to real violence, I think is a matter of extreme urgency for Congress to take up. It's not just about independence, it's about the actual safety of journalists who've been reporting for these outlets around the world. And related to that, as I mentioned in my testimony, is the Open Technology Fund, which has been a critical supporter for internet freedom around the world. And I think that the actions that we're seeing have this double effect of both interfering with the US role on press freedom and interfering with the US role on internet freedom worldwide.
May I add to that?
Please.
So many of the cases that the Committee to Protect Journalists reports on around the world have been cases of US AGM-related journalists, so Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, who come under threat because they are on the front lines. Let's recall that Radio Free Asia was the first outlet to report on the massive crackdown on Uyghurs in China and the internment there. That is a fundamentally important story. These journalists are risking their lives to help bring Americans and the world news from very challenging countries. Some of them have had to flee into exile. It's very difficult for journalists to continue working in journalism in exile, especially in their native language. these US AGM properties and outlets provide an opportunity for these journalists to continue working in journalism and providing information to closed countries that otherwise would not have access to independent or non-state media. And related to that is the technology that the Open Technology Fund has created or supported, not just for internet freedom, but for helping those journalists communicate securely and safely, for helping the people in those countries through circumvention technology to gain access to independent media. We are very, very concerned about the discussion around rescinding or reviewing those visas. No one wants to talk on the record about it because they're also fearing for their jobs. So it's very hard to document this. But let me tell you, we have heard from many journalists about the fears for them and their colleagues, and the independence and importance that these outlets have around the world in those countries was not built in a day. Trust takes a lifetime to build and can be rescinded in a moment. And that is the real danger here with the politicization of the agency and the potential for a lack of editorial independence.
Ms. Amanpour, do you have a comment on the actions of Mr. Pak and what it's done to our standing around the world and the threat to journalists?
Well, just to amplify what my colleagues have already said, just to take a quick step backwards, you know, Voice of America, just like the BBC World Service Radio, this is a way to amplify American soft power. It's a way to show the world objective, factual journalism. It's a way to really, you know, be able to bring stories as they've outlined to the world that they would never get in their own backyards from their own government. So I think it's almost like shooting yourself in the foot to damage the trust and credibility of these organizations. And I said in my statement that journalists around the world, including obviously in the United States, but if you look around the world, are being pushed into political corners. And this is one of the most dangerous effects, snowballing effects, in terms of getting any truth and facts. And as you know, Congressman, without truth, facts, and a knowledgeable electorate or population, you can't govern either. You know, it's all chaotic. So I think that, you know, politicizing or otherwise tampering with, you know, something like BOA, etc., has a long-term cascading, dangerous and deleterious effect.
Thank you. And I understand you have to leave us. Is that accurate?
Well, Congressman, I have to get ready for that eponymous show, which is going to be starting in a couple of hours. So I very much appreciate you asking me here. And thank you so much for hosting this very important committee and then these hearings.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony and your willingness to appear.